Playoffs. Yes, that's right. The fantasy playoffs are starting. I've got Eric Moody from ESPN joining me. We are about to dive into that week 15 rankings and all that, and all some of the good matchups coming up on the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Jeff Erickson. I'm with Eric Moody from ESPN. You can follow him on Twitter at EricInMoody. Catch his work on the Dynasty Watch, the waiver wire articles, and of course, just all across the ESPN brand. Eric, welcome to the RotoWire Podcast.
Yeah, appreciate the invite. Hey, it's always good to get together, talk fantasy football, NBA, sports in general. And plus, we got the holiday season right around the corner, so I'm kind of busy trying to hide like toys and things from the kiddos. I have to keep getting creative like each year. You know about that, right, Jeff?
Absolutely. So, how old are your kids?
I've got a 12-year-old who just turned 13. I know, as he always reminds me, and I've got a 9-year-old girl. So she's still in the thick of it, Santa Claus and all that stuff. Nice. My son's kind of wising up to the to the charade. But yeah, I've got 2 kiddos.
Yeah. So my younger one, I think she played dumb and learned. I think she knew about Santa Claus. Sorry kids if you're listening. And all the way up to like 11 or 12. But I think she knew. Younger one, she just was like, I called this, I called that. Like I think it was the Easter Bunny, and she saw right through the charade of everything, Tooth Fairy, everything, you name it. But it was pretty funny how that works. So my girls are 20 and almost 18. So great times, but I love the ages that you have right now. Love all the ages. They've been great so far. Just like me, just like almost everybody in the fantasy space, you had a different career before doing fantasy sports. What were you doing before?
Yeah, I was in the financial services industry. Yeah, I've been in that industry since since 2006.
Okay.
So I bounced around from a couple of different companies. I spent some time at the beginning of my career, like at Merrill Lynch, Chase Bank. I spent some time there, and then I eventually made my way to USAA. And I was at the point at my career, Jeff, where I was thinking, okay, things really hasn't worked out according to plan, like at Merrill Lynch and also at Chase. So USAA is going to be the last stand. If it doesn't work here, I'm going to transition out of the industry. But, I ended up creating fantasy content. It was back in, when did I start? It was back in 2015. Okay. So I ended up creating content back in 2015, getting on X, answering, it was Twitter back then, but answering starter sit questions and really just building a following. I had a chance to work with some great companies and contribute, 4 for 4, Fantasy Pros, Gridiron Experts and others. And so I just kind of continued to build an audience and build like a reputation. And I had a lot of success, at USAA. So I was actually at USAA for probably close to 10 years, for where the company went through a lot of changes, just like companies, in all over the world. And so with some of those changes that took place, I was thinking, okay, now may be a good time to leave. And I was looking to transition into the industry. But fortunately, at that time, I kind of crossed paths with some people at ESPN, started having some conversations, and kind of transitioned from Pro Football Network. I was in a senior fantasy football analyst role over to ESPN, where I've been ever since. Was that September 2021? So awesome. That's everything in a nutshell.
Yeah, my dad was a CFP for America for a while. So
very nice. You know about the industry there.
Yeah, no, yeah. It was his second. That was his second act, and he really enjoyed it. Was in sales before that. So, but it's funny. Like, there's no fantasy sports degree now. Maybe you can, people now can maybe get into data science and start their career path right away. Programmers obviously, but for the most part, we all were something else before we started doing this more and more as a profession. And I'm a recovering attorney, for instance. And although I never practiced full time, I got we launched our company back in 1997. Passed the bar. Was doing this on the side, doing another job. This took off, and I was doing it full time by 99. Never really practiced full time. Passed the bar, got sworn in and everything. And my dad, for years, like, you're keeping that degree fresh, right? You're gonna be an attorney someday. Oh, sure, Dad.
I love it.
Didn't work out that way, and A for that, because it's been fun. Let's talk about this week. It's the start of the fantasy playoffs for most people, unless you're like in the Scott Fish Bowl. But for the most part, this is week 1 of the fantasy playoffs. Do you have any special things you like to do with your teams? Any tips you can share for the listeners?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing when you're in the fantasy playoffs is just think about what your starting lineup is going to look like. I think now is the time to not necessarily say, how much depth, do I have? Now, you obviously want to keep players on your bench, but I would really try to keep as many running backs and wide receivers who have league-winning potential like on your bench as possible during the playoffs. And I'll give you some examples of that. I'm like, Ray Davis, backing up like James Cook is a great example. We've seen what he can do when given touches. Trey Benson's another great example. Connor hasn't played a full season in his NFL career, is getting a ton of touches for Arizona. So if he goes down, Benson will help fill the void. So you want to look at players that are available on the waiver wire or free agent pool that has that kind of league winning potential. And you really want to trim off the fat and just roster players that are like that and do everything that you can to make sure you put out the best starting lineup possible week in and week out.
I like that. And we saw, week 14 brought us two good examples of that. If you identified the right guy, there was in Seattle, there's Zach Charbonnet went off, had a huge day with Kenneth Walker out. He got that opportunity and took great advantage of it. And of course, Isaac Guerrendo too. Now Guerrendo was third in line. It took a little bit of, luck if you had rostered him already that both McCaffrey and Mason went down. But if you spent your waiver priority, spent your fab budget on him, it was also worth it. Now, and we'll get to this when we talk running backs, but we may have to replace Guerendo this week. So we'll see about that. But we haven't had a whole lot of that proof of concept in a while, just because running backs have stayed unusually healthy until now. So, but it's just a reminder, this is the potential. This is what you're looking for.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk quarterbacks. It's a busy week for quarterbacks right now. Starting off, a couple of guys I wanted to get your take on. Brock Purdy had a horrible day in the snow. Before that was dealing with a shoulder injury. I was starting to bury him in my rankings. And then he had this monster game against the Bears. And they just destroyed the Bears early and often. Are we back in the circle of trust with Brock Purdy?
I like how you framed that, the circle of trust. I would say absolutely. The one thing about Purdy, even though if they don't have Guerendo this week, they obviously don't have McCaffrey or Jordan Mason. I'm like, he's proven to be an effective quarterback in real life and also in fantasy. And he had a solid game last week. What do you have? 22 fantasy points against the Bears. I know in ESPN formats. So he's going up against the Rams this week, and what I would expect to be, a high scoring game. And so given the uncertainty surrounding Guerendo, even if he plays with the foot injury, I just think they'll double down on the passing game here. And one thing I like about Purdy, and he's got the playmakers surrounding him to take advantage of this, is just to get the ball in the hands of guys like Deebo Samuel, Juwan Jennings, George Kittle. Let them go to work and create yards after the catch. So I do like Purdy this week. I'm viewing him really as a low-end, not tight end one, obviously, low-end QB1, where I think he could score anywhere between 18 to 20 fantasy points this week. So if he's on your team, you're most likely starting him.
Yeah, and I have him as a fantasy starter as well in 12-team leagues. I've got him at 11. One spot above Patrick Mahomes. This is the world we're living in right now.
I know, right? Wild times.
Yeah. But, it's right there. Mahomes is a fringe fantasy starter. It's so weird to say that. I thought he might have been coming out of the wilderness a little bit there. He had a couple of decent fantasy games, but that offensive line's not doing great for Mahomes right now. At Cleveland, that could go well. It could be a weather game. Who knows? Cleveland games in December, I'm always worried about a little bit there.
Exactly.
But yeah, he's a tough call. And it's just, I think the offensive line is the worst he's had in front of him in a long time. Yeah,
no, I would agree with that. Yeah, they are giving up a lot of pressure. And the thing is that it's hard to quantify, like in fantasy. It's that, I played like offensive line, so I really like to look at offensive line play. It's that even if they aren't getting there to get the sacks, the defensive front, I'm like, just a quarterback knowing that, hey, he's under pressure and taking hits, I'm like, it can negatively impact things. I'll go as far as to say his offensive line play really influences everything that happens offensively, whether it's the running game or the passing game. Such an overlooked position, but yeah, it is playing a part.
Indeed. Anthony Richardson should be getting a little bit healthier of an offensive line coming off the bye.
Hopefully.
Have you seen enough out of him since him being reinstalled as the starter for the Colts to be a fantasy starter?
I get a lot of questions about Anthony Richardson. I look at him as like the epitome of like a boom or bust player. The booms are great, with the rushing potential, but the lows are very, very low. Like I remember that time against the Bears, back in week 3, he had like 5 fantasy points and then like 5 points, against Pittsburgh like the next week. And then, You obviously had the injury and kind of transitioned out where Flacco came in. But here's the deal. So the last 3 games, right? He scored 20 or more fantasy points in those 3 games. My biggest concern with Richardson is the completion percentage. It's really like a all or nothing scenario. He's either going to go boom or the lows can be really low. And I remember on Fantasy Football Now, it was a question that I answered in the social questions segment about, would you rather have like Kyler Murray or like Anthony Richardson? I was kind of leaning more towards Murray since he's a better passer than Richardson. But if you're in a situation where you need significant upside, I would plug Richardson in. But if you're looking for a player that has a higher floor, I would look elsewhere. So it really boils down to what your starting lineup looks like and what you're going to need to do to really overcome your opponent based on his or her roster.
For sure. By the way, Fantasy Football Now on Sunday mornings, part of my routine. I watch that every week. You guys do a great job. The whole crew there. I mean, nothing but love for Stefania for the whole crew there. Stefania used to write for us, so I always love seeing her work there. Yes, everybody there does a great job at Fantasy Football Now. Just want to give you guys a plug because it is awesome stuff. It's part of my routine.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
No problem. All right, Justin Herbert. I can't wait to see the next version of this team when they add more talent, either at wide receiver or running back. When we're talking about Will Dissly getting hurt and that being a big deal to the passing offense, that just kind of shows where we're at. Obviously, they didn't have Ladd McConkey on Sunday night. Huge matchup against Tampa Bay. I mean, this is like you really want to attack this Bucs secondary, especially with Winfield out now.
Yeah, definitely.
I just look at the lack of weapons that he has to work with there, and I just wonder what sort of ceiling does he have?
Yeah, and it's kind of one of those scenarios where I feel like I'm scratching my head because I really loved Justin Herbert a couple of weeks ago, still do for this week. Just with looking at the schedule, it's really one of the most favorable schedules. And the thing is, Jeff, he's just been really quiet lately. He's averaged just 13.1 fantasy points per game, over his last 3. But, you mentioned the Bucs secondary. That's really the good news for this week. They give up the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. And if you've got Ladd McConkey back in the mix, I feel a lot better about Herbert, bouncing back. But it's kind of hard to overlook Herbert. He's, depending on your league size, he's definitely on that QB1 radar. But he's also a high-end QB2, I would say, if you're in a 10-team format. But if you got him on your team, you're most likely going to have to start him. I think he has a very high ceiling this week. So I'll give him a thumbs up.
Yeah, I lost Dak in one league, and Herbert was my backup, and I'm kind of scrambling. It's either him or Richardson or Bryce Young. That's who was available, and so it's just every week I'm kind of playing the matchups there. So I really am hoping McConkey comes back because I think he's kind of transformative for this team.
Agreed. Yeah, they need him back, definitely.
Speaking of Bryce Young, mention him. I actually, if Xavier Legette holds on to that last ball, we're having a whole different conversation about Bryce Young and these 2-minute drills that he's leading the team on lately.
Yeah, it was painful watching that. I remember I had Red Zone on at the time, and I remember watching, seeing them show a replay of that play, and I was like, oh, just painful. But here's the thing, Jeff, we thought that going into that week that it wasn't a great matchup, but I'd go as far as to say that Young has looked sharp since getting the job back. Was in week 8. Over the last 2 games, he's also shown really good chemistry with veteran receiver Adam Thielen, which is good to see. And, they go up against this Cowboys defense, right? They give up I think the 5th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. And Young has had 16 or more fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3 games. And so I think he's a solid option for fantasy managers that are in super flex formats, or if you're really scrambling in a single QB league, hey, I think he's a great option this week. I think he'll get more than 16. I wouldn't be surprised if he has another 20 to 23 point fantasy day against
I agree.
the Cowboys D. So
yeah, my only concern is maybe it's just a run heavy script or something of that nature there with Chuba Hubbard, but at the same time, they keep losing other running backs. Unfortunately, we saw the horrible news with Brooks. That was terrible. Sanders is definitely out. Even Blackshear got hurt. The backup now is Mike Boone. But we'll see what happens. But the Cowboys, though, I mean, people were talking about streaming the Cowboys heading into the playoffs because of this matchup. They just lost Overshone for the year and probably next year as well. Brutal injury on Monday night. But I think Carolina could move the ball against them.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think a lot of people are kind of sleeping on the Panthers' offense for this week. I love Bryce Young as a sleeper. Adam Thielen's another guy. I'm just trying to think of players who don't have a high roster percentage in ESPN leagues. Xavier Leggette's another one. I'm sure he'll want to bounce back after his performance. So yeah, could be a fantasy bonanza there in Carolina that we didn't see coming.
Exactly. We're going to talk running backs next, but first, got a quick note from our friends at DraftKings Pick 6 and their Pick 6 app.
We're proud to be brought to you by DraftKings Pick 6. So many NFL offerings each week over at Pick 6. Been enjoying playing on the Pick 6 platform each and every week of the NFL season. Think a certain quarterback will throw for more than 300 yards. How about your favorite receiver scoring a touchdown? Check out Pick 6, the newest way to play fantasy football and win cash right now with DraftKings. Here's how it works. Just pick 2 to 6 players of the same sport and choose if they'll have more or less of a given stat. Yards, catches, touchdowns, etc. Lock in those picks and compete against opponents for a shot at huge cash prizes. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use our code ROTOPICK. That's ROTOPICK. Again, ROTOPICK, ROTOPICK. If you're a new Pick 6 customer, play $5, get $50 in Pick 6 credits guaranteed. Just use that code ROTOPICK. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-78-89-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 plus. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. See terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos.
Thanks to DraftKings for their sponsorship. Thanks to my co-host Nick Whalen for doing that dramatic read. I am Jeff Erickson. I'm here with Eric Moody. You can follow Eric on Twitter at EricInMoody. And of course, follow all of his content at ESPN.com. Eric, let's talk running backs. We talked about this a little bit earlier with Isaac Guerendo being the next man up, stepping in a very positive offense. Is Patrick Taylor the next guy with Guerendo dealing with this sprained foot? How aggressive are you in free agency on him?
Yeah, I'm like, if you need a running back, you're in the fantasy playoffs. Yeah, I would go ahead and pick up Taylor. It was a pretty good matchup going against the Rams defense. It's just an unfortunate situation, just given all the injuries they've had at running back. And then it's like, as the game ends, the dust settles on week 14, and you're just like, he's dealing with a foot sprain. It doesn't help that it's such a short turnaround. So I'm conflicted about Taylor because you just wonder, like, how much usage is he going to get? Will they just double down on the passing game? But with that said, if you got a guy that's looking to get volume like Taylor is, if you need a running back, you got to go pick him up and kind of start him as an RB2 or as a flex, depending on what you need. So
yeah, exactly. And I just wonder, are they going to use him as the same sort of workhorse back as they have the other backs, or is it going to be like him and Vaughn or Abaconda? I wonder if he gets the same sort of treatment because Shanahan likes to go with one back and really ride it, but we're kind of going down the food chain here a little bit. This is like the 5th back now for the Niners. So yeah, this is the guy who was on the practice squad earlier. Is he going to get that usage on Thursday night?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. You can never tell with Shanahan. I just felt like, at least my opinion, that they would just kind of take a committee approach, just given the circumstances surrounding like Taylor. Like Guerendo's been there like all season. He's even kind of weaved in whenever McCaffrey was out. With Jordan Mason, but who knows? But it's obviously some upside there with Taylor. It's obviously some risk, so you just got to do what's best for your team depending on what you need. So
exactly. All right, let's move on to the Tampa Bay Bucks. Bucky Irving hurt his back. If you watch the play where I think he got hurt, you could see him kind of go down even before he got hit. It looked like it was a awkward stumble, and it's a back injury. Those can tend to linger. Rachaad White got heavy usage after that. We saw Sean Tucker with 3 carries, one really big one, but with more time to prepare, how do you think the Bucks use their backfield this week?
Yeah, and I think it's one of those scenarios. If you do have Bucky Irving, who plays, I think we're still looking at a committee. But even if, let's say, if Irving is out, I think Sean Taylor will still kind of get weaved in and get some touches. So I think the best way to approach Rachaad White is just kind of look at him as a low end RB2. I'm like, he's been productive. I'm like, you look at his fantasy point total, especially over the past couple of weeks. I know he finished with 11.7 fantasy points against the Giants back in week 12. He ended up having 13 touches in that game, had 12 touches the next game, and had 9 fantasy points. But obviously last week he finished with nearly 25. But he had 19 touches, obviously, with Irving kind of being ruled out and taken out of that game. And so I think if you're looking at him as like an RB2, you're not setting yourself up for like disappointment. So if he at least gives you like 10 points, you'll be happy with that. If he does exceed expectations and give you more, then you'll be happy there. So I just think it's one of those things, how you view White and your perspective. But I do like him like as an RB2 if you need to plug him in.
Yeah, I always like the pass catching floor he brings.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
he's a really good pass catcher, and I think he's pretty good in pass pro too. Gets him more snaps. I think that's one. You talked earlier about offensive lines getting overlooked. I also think the blocking skills. We don't want our players to block, but it gets them on the field.
Yeah, you're right.
And then that leads into like some check downs, and it leads to those other things. You get the little bonus points there, here and there. Devon Achane. He's getting a scoring floor for us because he's catching passes, but this Dolphins running game is really concerning to me. Really couldn't get it going against the Jets last week. What's your take on Achane?
Yeah, and he's one of those players for where I'm like, he's a threat to score a touchdown like anytime like he touches the ball. But we haven't had those type of Devon Achane games that we've come to expect. And I really expected him to have a bigger game like last week. He did finish with 19 fantasy points. So you'll take it. But I'll say the positives are the touches. The touches are there. I'm like, he's getting, let me kind of look at the numbers real quick. I can't think of them off the top of my head. But he's had, 13 or more touches in 3 out of the last 4 games.
Mm-hmm.
In each one of those games, he scored 19 or more fantasy points. And so, he may not have that, matchup winning kind of performance like Saquon Barkley has had many times this year. But I'm like, if you're looking for like a solid RB1 that can give you 15 or more fantasy points, I think he's your guy. But that matchup against Houston, would expect that to be like a high-scoring game. And you look at Houston's defense; they haven't exactly been like a juggernaut this year. So I still have confidence in Achane. I know you drafted him, in draft, for a reason and for this time. So just plug him in. He's still an RB1 for me.
Yeah, and Tua's playing so well right now that you're gonna probably get some passing. You can count on the little passing floor there, which I do like. You wrote up Sincere McCormick in your waiver wire article this week. Tweeted about him. He's a definite object of attention here. And who is Sincere McCormick? This is a guy that was coming off the practice squad a couple of weeks ago. Now, he's the first guy to get over 60 rushing yards against the Chiefs as a running back this year. Now he's like the workhorse back for the Raiders. How much can we count on him the rest of the way?
Yeah, I get a lot of questions about McCormick, and it's interesting. This is a guy that's been in the league, for I think 2 or 3 years, like at this point, but he's finally had his opportunity, to come off the practice squad and really to get meaningful snaps. So you've got that narrative that's in play, someone who's finally getting an opportunity and really wants to make the most of it. But really the opportunity presented itself, Jeff. Obviously Zamir White went down, Alexander Madison, they're dealing with injuries, but you look at the workload, like over the last 2 games, I'm like McCormick's 27 rushing attempts. You mentioned this stat earlier, top 60 rushing yards, like in both of those games. This is also a guy that's averaging an impressive 5.2 yards per carry. The Raiders' running game has been like a dystopian wasteland, like in like a Mad Max movie. He's like the ray of sunshine that's finally coming in for this team. And I was surprised his roster percentage in ESPN leagues isn't higher. Last time I checked, which was like earlier this morning, I believe it was like maybe 21%. Definitely a significant increase from last week to this week. But looking at him against a shaky Falcons defense, I think he's in a great spot to keep the momentum going. I do like him kind of as an RB3 or flex option with upside. So that's kind of how I'm viewing him this week.
If he and Patrick Taylor are 2 most realistic options to be available on the waiver wire this week, which would you prefer?
I would prefer McCormick.
Me too.
I'm just a little worried about the uncertainty with Taylor and just considering like all the playmakers, that are like surrounding him. You just don't know. It's like you could say, okay, hey, this guy's a lock to get 10 or more touches. But then when you have guys like George Kittle, we've seen how lethal that he is, and Debo and Juwan Jennings, who's been like phenomenal. He may be like the waiver wire pickup of the year potentially with how that guy is playing. But anyway, I digress. But looking at McCormick, it's like the Raiders, they have very few like playmakers, but also given the quarterback situation, why not just double down on the running game and just feed Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers? So I want McCormick.
You mean you're not big into the Desmond Ridder revenge game narrative?
Antonio Pierce is just like, man, I'm just trying to win some games here. And I think the way that you win is not by allowing Desmond Ridder to get revenge. I'm sure he'll have his opportunities, but I would just lean heavily on McCormick and just allow that running game to kind of open things up,
Yeah, absolutely. One other running back situation here, the Jets. If Breece Hall misses it looks like a pretty even timeshare between Braelon Allen and Isaiah Davis. Do you have a preference between those two?
You know what? You would ask me this last week before the game. I would have said Braelon Allen because it's a frustrating situation because you're like, okay, Breece Hall earlier in the season, Allen has been like backing him up, but then they kind of started to weave in Isaiah Davis, and so I think it's one of those situations where if you need to start one of those guys, just get whoever's available and just keep your fingers crossed and like hope for the best. But if Breece Hall is out, I just see them having a fairly even split of the touches and snaps, just like they did last week. So you just kind of pick your poison and really hope for the best in that scenario. Or you can just go start McCormick, who I think has a much higher floor of touches. So you can do that too.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into Dave Trimble's question. He says in the chat there, Warren, Isaiah Davis, and Sear McCormick or Patrick Taylor. Yeah. I think I'd go McCormick too. Yeah,
no, I think this is the kind of guy that we could be talking about, Jeff. Once the season is ended, where we're like, hey, this guy was like a league winner. Like, imagine if he goes off against the Falcons and has like 25 like fantasy points. I think we're going to be talking about that once the season ends. So
yeah, and you this time of year, teams will turn to that unknown. They'll give them that workload there, and that this is, you got to be sharp. You got to be on top of that. I mean, this is like a time-honored thing. Running backs at the end of the season, a fresh one comes in, everybody else is tired. He gets that opportunity and does well with it there. You see that it's a repeatable tale there. See it all the time. We're going to talk wide receivers next. But first, we got a quick note from our friends over at LIV Golf. A new season of LIV Golf Fantasy is coming in 2025. New prizes, new ways to win, and more are coming in the new season. Get ready to play and sign up now at fantasy.livegolf.com. Thanks to LIV Golf for their sponsorship. I am with Eric Moody from ESPN.com. We are talking wide receivers next. Juwan Jennings was a great pickup. There aren't too many other great ones lately. I want to talk about, though, one of our mainstays, AJ Brown, who has not been a fantasy producer lately, who's very frustrated after this last game. They asked him, what do we need to work on? He goes, the passing game. Is this going to be a squeaky wheel situation this week against the Steelers? Are we going to get a ton of targets for AJ Brown?
Yeah, I would say so. It's kind of one of those things you really can't like quantify, but just look at the last two games. It's against Carolina and against the Ravens. I think the bad thing is, and the frustrating thing is, that you're looking at these matchups saying, hey, these are great matchups. But then you got Saquon Barkley and how productive the running game is. So it's like, okay, we don't need to really double down on the passing game. And I really loved AJ Brown's matchup like last week, especially the cornerback matchup that he had. But he just had 4 targets, and he did catch all of them, but he didn't have the fantasy day that I expected or his managers expected. So I think we're seeing one of those scenarios, even in a difficult matchup against the Steelers secondary, that I think they'll feed Brown, like a ton of targets. The irony is that this is a guy that only had one game this season, like with 10 targets. That was week 1 against Green Bay. He had 10 targets. He caught 5 of them, but he finished with 22.9 fantasy points. I could see kind of a performance like that for this week against Pittsburgh. Just give the guy 10 targets. Let's see what happens. But here's the reality. If you got A.J. Brown, you're not going to bench him in the fantasy playoffs. That's right. I don't care what you're going to say about, I'm going to go with the best matchup. I'm like, you drafted the guy for a reason. You're going to start him. Let's just hope we have the fireworks that we're looking for. So I'm still optimistic.
Yeah, my rule of thumb always is I use the matchups to break a tie. I don't use it to create a tie that then I'm trying to try to resolve. There's a question earlier in the forum in the live stream asking, should I bench Amon-Ra for Jennings this week? My answer is no. I know that Jennings has been great. His profile has been raised. The matchup is good against the Rams, but I'm never benching Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Yeah, just put him in there and just see what happens. That's the best way to approach.
Your mileage may vary. It's definitely not a 100% chance it goes that way, but I'm playing the percentages there, and I think it's a 3-to-1 chance that Amon-Ra still outproduces Jennings. As much as I have nothing but love for Juwan Jennings, I think he's been a great pickup for us, and I love that he's raised his game in the wake of Ayuk's injury.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Courtland Sutton's another player who's really raised his game. As the Broncos have gotten better, as Bo Nix has gotten better, Sutton's production has also risen. Pretty decent matchup this week against the Colts too.
Yeah, no, I really like Courtland Sutton. I'm trying to think about where I had him ranked. Let me check real quick. I had him at wide receiver 15. So, love him as a wide receiver too. The targets are there. I think he's had, 9 or more targets in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think in 5 of his last 6 games.
Yeah.
I have to think about that for a second. So that's obviously encouraging. But you mentioned about Bo Nix. I think he's in a great spot. And really the passing game coming out of the bye week. The Colts defense, they give up the 7th most passing yards per game. So that's encouraging. Nix has also been pretty consistent. He scored 17 or more fantasy points in 4 of his last 6 games. That includes 2 with 28 or more. Courtland Sutton's been a huge part of his success. So I just think they'll feed him in this matchup, and I think he'll have a big game. And I also think this game will be a lot closer than people expect. Also do score predictions at ESPN as well, and picks, for each game. And so I think my score prediction was Broncos win this 24-19. So passing game should be actively involved throughout the game. I like Sutton this week.
Yeah, I do too. And the close game is your friend, definitely with that there.
Yes,
in the passing game for sure. I'm kind of curious, if they kind of unlock some things on the deep play, especially that laser to Mims in the Monday night game. Is that something that they can do a little bit more of? Because they spend a pretty high draft pick on Mims. We heard a lot of talk about Mims, and they haven't really used him a whole lot in the last couple of years. The way, when you see that play, that lightning that can hit, they should maybe do that more often. That seems fun.
Yeah, no, I think they should. I think one thing that thinking back with the Broncos, that I like what kind of Sean Payton has done. It's he's kind of adding different things to Bo Nix's plate every week.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's handled him as a rookie very well. Now I know what some people may be thinking, he's an older rookie. He is. He has a lot of collegiate experience, but I think Peyton's kind of piecemealing things together at a pretty good pace. And so maybe we'll see Mims kind of get a little bit more involved for the rest of the season. But yeah, I could definitely see it. Well, I'm kind of curious to see what wrinkle they'll add this week, especially coming out of the bye week for Nick. So
exactly. Another player coming out of the bye week is Terry McLaurin. I got a question in the chat: Terry McLaurin or Juwan Jennings? This is interesting because McLaurin, they made a point in the Titans game of getting him established early because the previous games they didn't throw to him a lot. That Eagles game on Thursday night was terrible for him. Yeah, there was the one big play against Dallas really late. Otherwise, that would have been a disaster game. Fortunately, the big play did happen. It wasn't. But can we count on McLaurin to get enough volume, or would you go to Jennings in this matchup?
Yeah, I'm both of these players are in great situations. I would lean more towards McLaurin. I'm a little bit more bullish on McLaurin this week than some of my colleagues. I've got him as as my wide receiver 10. I do have Jennings. Let me kind of load up the page and scroll down. It's the wide receiver 20. I just really like that matchup that McLaurin has going up against the Saints secondary. They give up the 5th most receiving yards per game this season to wide receivers. And one thing about McLaurin too, he's been getting a pretty decent amount of targets from Jaden Daniels. That duo's got some pretty good rapport. So I just have a better feeling this week, on McLaurin to Jennings. But both are great options. So if you're fortunate enough to have both, try to find a way to start them both. But if you were forcing me to choose, I would go with McLaurin here.
All right. I have McLaurin at 17. I have Jennings at 22. So I'm right there with you. At number 23, I have one of last week's week winners in Jordan Addison, who just went off last week. The first touchdown was a little lucky. It was, you saw Darnold's arm get hit. It was a little bit of an arm punt, and he won the battle for the ball. But he made some real awesome plays after that too. And that's the thing about Addison. He is definitely another one of those lightning type of players.
Yeah, it's funny because I chuckle because a lot of Justin Jefferson fantasy managers are just kind of you got to be kidding me. With all this volume and success that Jordan Addison is having, and I'm thinking with I kind of had an interesting stat. Let me see if I can remember it. But Sam Darnold and Jordan Addison, they're the 4th different quarterback receiver duo since 2000 to have at least 3 touchdowns in a game. Mm-hmm. They're both from the same college. So once I noticed that, I'm that really cracked me up because it's just you got to love that. I got to love that connection. But I do like Jordan Addison this week. I'm trying to think about where I have him ranked, so I'm gonna have to check. I cannot
got
remember.
the Monday night game against the Bears. There are 2 Monday night games, by the way, folks. Another one of those.
Yeah.
So
Where
you got that, and we got Atlanta and Vegas. So big, TV games there. No, not really, but okay.
I've actually got him. I know some of my other colleagues are a little bit higher on Addison, but I've got him at wide receiver 34 for right now.
Okay.
I just think mainly just because of the matchup, but I'm like, if you've got him, I'm like, in many cases you're going to you're going to start him. Yeah, I really can't say anything bad about him. I'm like, in many cases, if you've got him, like the worst you can do is plug him in as a flex option. But I like him as a flex option or wide receiver 3, depending on what kind of a league that you're in. He's been getting a lot of targets too. I'm like, he had a season high in targets, against Atlanta. He had 12.
Yeah.
So any time where he gets targets, I'm like, he's definitely productive. I think the last game where he had his second highest point total of the season, he had 30 fantasy points. That was also against the Bears, and he had 9 targets there.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying you can't quantify this, but if I'm like the Bears secondary and we're like, okay, we're going up against Minnesota again, they remember what Jordan Addison was able to do. I don't think they're going to allow Jordan Addison to beat them like that 2 games in a row.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think they focused on trying to shut down Jefferson in that game.
Yeah,
and I think the Vikings took advantage of that and just went to Addison more. It's going to be tough to shut down Jefferson. They still might have that approach, but who knows? We have a different defensive play caller now. Eberflus is gone. He was calling all the defensive plays, so that's going to change things a little bit there. The Bears are in this transition phase.
Yeah,
and neither unit showed up in the first half of that game against the Niners last week. They were marginally better in the second half, but the defense just had a rough game all around. So we'll see. One of the guys I put Addison over was Marvin Harrison, who I just keep on pushing down a little bit. This is a guy that was getting drafted in the second round, and now, it's frustrating because we're not getting the consistency from week to week on him.
No. Yeah, no, we don't. It's thinking about Harrison, it was frustrating early in the year because they would kind of have him involved in the first half of games, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then in the second half, or after the first quarter, excuse me, his big time was the first quarter. Then after that, they didn't really have him involved, and I just don't know if him and Kyler Murray aren't completely in sync. I do have some cautious optimism for this week going up against the Patriots, because I think the frustrating thing is, you mentioned his draft capital. We expected him to be a wide receiver 1 for us, a lock week in and week out, but he scored, single digits, in 3 of his last 4 games. But one thing about the Patriots defense, they give up a lot of fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers. So you're like, hey, there may be hope for this week. But just to kind of close the loop on that, I've got him ranked as the wide receiver 29. So we'll see if it happens this week. But I'm comfortable plugging him out there as a flex, depending on who else you have on your roster. But it's tough to really have optimism with Harrison. So
agreed. I've got him at 30. So we're pretty much in lockstep there as far as that goes. One last wide receiver, Jameson Williams, my number 31 this week. Home game against the Bills. With Williams, it's all about, it's another boomer bust sort of guy. You get those big plays, great. You're not going to get 10 to 12 targets in a game. So you really got to hit the big play with him.
Yeah, no, I like Jameson Williams this week. I've got him wide receiver 30. If my memory serves me right. He's one of those guys for where, hey, he's a great flex option. Gives you a relatively, high floor, but he's got a much higher ceiling. Obviously, if he goes boom, kind of see what some of his point totals were. I think the biggest thing with him, though, with that boom or bust nature, I'm like, his yards per reception, over the last 4 games is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So if he catches the ball, you're going to get a chunk of yards. But to your point about the targets, I think one thing that was fascinating, though, he's had 7 or more targets in 3 out of his last 4 games. And he scored, looks like 11 or more fantasy points in 3 out of those 4 games, including one that was the highest one at 22.6. And so that's just kind of what you're looking at when you're looking at Williams. So you want to hope that he gets one of those big plays, then everything else kind of builds around that. But in a matchup against Buffalo that, we expect to be a high-scoring game, have one of the highest point totals on the slate. Should be a lot of points scored in this game. And also it helps that they're playing Buffalo at home, so you don't have to worry about the weather. I think it would be a great spot for Williams. So
yeah, second week of a 2-game road trip for the Bills too. Obviously they're coming off their worst defensive game in a long time. I think Puka scored again. I hope there was a game where I was going up against Josh Allen and Puka Nacua, so that was fun. Yeah, that was game over after 2 players.
Is that like the equivalent of, you've got, the meme, hide the pain, which I'd use often on X. That made me think about that because that's just painful because those guys were balling that game.
Dude, it was so high scoring this week too, all over the board. I had lots of DFS lineups with Garendo and Zach Charbonnet and Addison, and I still didn't win. I was like, what is going on here? And
what is happening?
You had to get everything right. And I there's some people that did it and they just kind of got that answer key. Like, I had the wrong cheap quarterback or something like that. Like, well, okay, someone else had Sam Darnold, so I'm screwed, or someone just paid up for Allen and, made it all work. And, there was plenty of those little pathways there this last week. We're going to talk tight ends. But first, quick note from our friends at the Blue Wire Network. Thank you for your patience there, folks. Thanks to Blue Wire for hosting us. They've been hosting us for multiple years now. Love being on the Blue Wire Network. Let's talk tight ends. Pat Freiermuth, I got a question about him earlier in the week. Is he like, is he like a lock steady starter at tight end for us this week? Is he like a low end tight end 1 now?
Yeah, no, I really like Freiermuth. I remember writing him up for the waiver wire column. I had him ranked like as a tight end 11. So I just remember, I know I had him as like a kind of like a tight end 1. Yeah, I think that the bigger thing is like he's really stepped up in the Steelers passing game since their bye in week 9. Like he's had 10 or more fantasy points, 5 straight games. I would say where I kind of have a little trepidation. I'm like he's had just 4 or more targets like in 2 of those games. I'm like Russell Wilson isn't averaging a ton of pass attempts. I think 30.4 per game during that time frame. But I'm like, if you need a tight end, I'm like, and it's been a position where a lot of people have struggled this year, just given underperformance from some of those upper echelon names, is that like you can't go wrong like with Freiermuth. So don't overlook them. Like they've got the Ravens and the Chiefs like in week 16 and 17, which should be really attractive. Both of those teams rank in the top 8 in terms of fantasy points per game allowed to tight ends. And
yes, that's right.
If he's still available, and you need a tight end, I would pick him up. I know I can't recall like his current percentage now, but I know when writing the waiver wire column, he was only rostered like in 48% of ESPN leagues. So if he's available in yours, scoop him.
Yeah. Up against the Eagles this week, not a great matchup, but I still not one that I would just totally like bury him either. We had a question in the forum earlier, Andrews versus Freiermuth. I'd still go Andrews, but with Pickens likely out this week, you got to expect a couple extra targets there, maybe go Freiermuth's way. So we'll see if that happens. Yeah,
but good point.
I do like him. I still would go with Andrews, who's resuscitated his value pretty nicely lately. Zach Ertz. This is a guy that's been sneakily pretty productive. I think he's one of Daniel's favorite red zone targets.
Yeah, it's a lot to like about Zach Ertz. Should be relatively healthy, coming out of the bye week. But I'm like before that, like from weeks 11 through 13, I'm like he scored like a touchdown like in every single game. So 3 consecutive games of touchdowns. He's had like 6 or more targets in each game as well. And he's produced because of those touchdowns. Like he's had 12 or more fantasy points in each of those games. And so going up against like New Orleans, who's been like horrendous, like on defense, can't recall like how many fantasy points that they allow like to tight ends and like receiving yards. But you kind of mentioned about kind of the rapport between Ertz and Jaden Daniels. It's hard to see him not being involved in this matchup, just how horrendous the Saints defense has been. So I do like Ertz this week, if you're in need of a tight end, if he's somehow available, but I think he's rostered like in a high percentage of leagues, but I do like him as a really like a high end tight end 2 with a tight end 1 upside.
Yeah. And he's the prototypical touchdown dependent tight end. If he gets the touchdown, it's a good week. He's going to get you like 6 or 7 other maybe targets. You're not, and that could be, unless they're playing catch up. If they're playing catch up, but I don't think they will be against the Saints. But if they are, then I think that profile raises a little bit because I just remember a lot of 2 minute drill against the Eagles where he he just made his fantasy day. He just got like 4 or 5 catches on that 2-minute drive, including the touchdown there. Last tight end we'll talk about is Kyle Pitts a drop. Should we just, I'm done trying to make Kyle Pitts happen, but is he just a straight up drop and let him be a poison pill for somebody else's roster?
You know what? I think so. I know his roster percentage dipped like in ESPN leagues. I think it dropped by like 7 or 8%, if my memory serves me correctly.
Yeah.
But it's really a frustrating player to roster. And this is coming from someone who I was very bullish on this Falcons offense coming into the year, just with the coaching staff that they have there.
Yeah,
the new offensive coordinator, Kirk Cousins, he's we can have a whole nother conversation about him. But as far as sticking at the Pitts, sticking on the Pitts here, I would say he is, because I was trying to do some Cowboy math here. What does he have? Like, it's definitely less than 5 fantasy points over like the last 3 games. It's been pretty dire. So if you've got someone else that you're looking at, like a streamer or just another tight end that happens to be available, I would scoop them up, because it's some guys out there like Jake Ferguson. I'd much rather start, Jonnu Smith, Tucker Kraft. I'm like, it's guys that you may have on your roster, or even guys that may be available on the waiver wire. Like we talked about Pat Freiermuth, Juwan Johnson's another guy. I would much rather go to battle with guys like that than Kyle Pitts. So just to answer your question.
In the last 5 games, here's Pitts' lines. Against the Cowboys, 1 for 11. Against the Saints, 4 for 55. And, one of those was a really big play. Against the Broncos, 1 for 9, and just a total no-show for the entire team. 0 for 0 against the Chargers. And then last week, 1 for 14 on 6 targets. He's had 1 startable game in the last 5. The Bucs aren't walking through that door. It's really the Bucs that kind of made his season. He had 2 really good games against the Bucs. He's only had 3 touchdowns all year. It looked like there was a stretch weeks 5 through 8. Like, okay, this is the Kyle Pitts we've been waiting for. But now it's back to this, and a lot of this might be on Cousins. But you know what? Even if it is Penix next year, it's going to be on somebody else's roster. He's almost the next OJ Howard for me. I'm done trying to make it happen.
Ooh. That's a bad comparison, but it looks like we're trending that way. No, I'm like, this was the year to make it happen. You don't have to worry about Arthur Smith and how many routes he's running or if he's in there blocking. This was the year to make it happen, and it just hasn't materialized. So no shame there with that comparison. So
I'd start Juwan Johnson over him this week. That's I might even start Dawson Knox, who got 1 target last week. I just think they'll need to throw more this week again. So I think Knox maybe gets a little bit more, but that's how bearish I am on Pitts, unfortunately. And it makes me very sad because I had a lot of him this year. So shame on me. Yeah. Eric, this has been super fun. I can't believe 45 minutes went just like that. So I really appreciate you coming on board. Tell everybody where they can find your work once again.
Yeah, no, I can do that. I would just say, first of all, if I'm chatting with you for the first time, I'm like, stop what you're doing. Follow me on X at Eric N. Moody. I love to interact with everyone there, answer questions. I do other posts as well, just to kind of help you win your fantasy football league. As far as content, I'm like, everything's over at ESPN. I cover the NFL, NBA, and WNBA from a fantasy lens and also from a sports betting perspective. So we'll have betting picks for Monday Night Football. And I'll also contribute to different columns. Like you'll have one that's published tomorrow that's going to cover fantasy X factors. I choose a fantasy X factor from every game that's on the slate. And then also have sleepers, that's part of a E+ column that's published on Saturday.
Nice.
But follow me on X. I'm like, that's where we can interact the most. I respond to DMs. I respond to, to posts or tweets, whatever you want to call them. So that's the best place to catch me. But Jeff, hey, appreciate the invite. I'm glad we've been able to do this. I know we've been running around in the X or Twitter streets for quite a while, but this is the first time we had to do that, and I had a blast, my man.
Awesome. Really glad you did. I really enjoyed it. Big thanks to everybody for tuning in. All the great questions there. Really appreciate that. And if we didn't get you answered, hit up Eric and I on Twitter. He's at Eric N. Moody. I'm at Jeff_Erickson. Check out our respective websites as well. Thanks again for listening. Have a great day. Take care.